Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second webinar in our MOOC, Water Addressing the Global Crisis. Today, we have Dr. John H. Matthews from AGWA, and he is answering all our questions. So I hope that you guys are very excited. Yes, so let's welcome Dr. John H. Matthews.
Great, thanks so much. I want to show just a few slides to get things started. I'm really grateful for those of you who tuned in, and I hope we have a really good dialogue today. Let's see. There we go. And there it is. All right. I wanted to give kind of a very quick overview of the topics that are in the 4 climate change modules. I'm a climate change specialist. I've been working on climate change and water issues for a long time, since around 2003. And I helped found AGWA. AGWA's been around since 2010. We're the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation. So the first module, first chapter, really focuses on the question about what is climate, what is weather, trying to understand the distinction, some of the basic vocabulary. It's really confusing often, and frankly, you would be right in being confused by a lot of media outlets, a lot of journalism, because many journalists themselves are a little bit vague. I'm from the U.S., and our president is pretty confused about the difference between weather and climate. Oh, I'm not going to go into all that detail.
John, just a second. Okay, now we can finally see. The pictures weren't showing, but now it's showing. Thank you. Sorry. Continue.
Oh, okay. Can you see it now?
Yeah.
Okay, good. All right. The second module is really focused on the idea of uncertainty, and the basic problem here is that we have managed water for many centuries, based on the idea that if we can look at the past and see how we see patterns in rainfall, in river flow, and groundwater recharge, that we can use that as a way to understand what will happen in the future. And climate change really fundamentally alters that assumption. So we can't trust it anymore. So that's the real primary threat that we see for water management and sustainability of the water cycle with regard to climate change. And I'm not going to go into that either. And third topic that we covered, the third module, really looks at the kind of a growing practice. What's the state of the art? And this is really important, because many of the practices that we've used assume that we can be confident about the future, so we can build infrastructure or design systems to provide energy or irrigate fields, or protect our cities and ecosystems. And if we don't understand the future very well, then maybe we need to make some big adjustments. So there's been a lot of development really just in the past 10 years, where some of the new generation of practices began. And I would say in the last 3 to 5 years is when we've started to see really significant efforts come into play that represent what I would say the kind of water management, resilient water management, that we'll be doing probably for the next 50 or 100 years.
John, sorry to interrupt. The students are saying that they can't see your video, so maybe I think there's something wrong with when you share the screen. Now I can see it again. So I don't know why it goes black when you're presenting. Yeah, now we can see it. So maybe just minimize it so we can continue watching.
Okay.
Yeah, now we can see it. So now it works. Thank you.
All right. Well, apologies. Anyway, so the fourth module focuses on some of the social implications, and this is often, as I pointed out in that module, this is a very controversial area. It's often very politically sensitive in many countries, and there is a lot of uncertainty too. But we all know that climate change does have an impact on our communities, on our cultures, even religious issues, and it can create a social and cultural conflict between states, within states, and hopefully it also, I would argue that it actually is starting to become a mechanism to also bring us together in some ways, so such as the UNFCCC COP process. I just wanted to also give kind of a quick update on the water management section. I referred to some of these emerging areas of practice, and one of the topics that I referred to is a document that was prepared by the World Bank. It's called the Decision Tree Framework. It's the blue book that's on the left. It's something that you can download from the URL at the bottom of the screen, agwaguide.org. And it's one of these bottom-up methodologies that is used by development bank loan officers and their country clients, and how they think about a very wide range of resilient water projects. The second one has actually published since we did the filming for these modules, and it's called Climate Risk Informed Decision Analysis, CRIDA or CRIDA. It's been in process for a long time, about 7 or 8 years, and it has just published too. It's been implemented in 15 or 16 countries to date, and I know of many other projects globally that are in process. So, and it's a more general document. It looks at a wide range of institutions and also includes a lot of ecological material. It really emphasizes the two kind of key components that I talk about for resilience: robustness and flexibility. So that's a free download. It's a UNESCO publication, and you can get it for free from the AGWA Guide site. This is kind of an overview of CRIDA. If we get some questions on it, I can show that later. And the last point I just want to make is you might have some questions about what happened at the last UNFCCC COP. It was in Katowice in Poland in December, and I will also, as far as I know, be attending the COP in Chile in November of this year. So also happy to talk about kind of higher level policy processes. It looks like some of the early questions focus on that. And then I really, I welcome your questions. I hope you'll visit the AGWA website. We have a podcast too that's on climate adaptation with a very strong water focus, and we engage in a lot of outreach too. So we really welcome your participation. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much for that brief overview, John. So let's go to the questions from our students. The first question we have from Catherine, and she asks, how best can climate change mitigation measures become inclusive for everyone, especially those with poor water governance driven by economic and political instabilities?
That's a very powerful question. I was in a workshop some years ago in which a representative from Indonesia stood up, and it was about climate and energy processes, and this Indonesian national said, you're talking in the developed world about kind of imposing your energy policies on the developing world, when you have basically created the problem, and it's pretty inexpensive for us to build a new coal-fired power plant when it doesn't do that much to the climate. Why are you imposing your values on us, basically? That's a really understandable feeling, and I certainly, as someone from a developed country, I have a certain amount of carbon guilt, And we have basically, become developed countries by emitting all of these greenhouse gases. That said, even in the last 3 years, there've been some significant changes in how we think about energy production, energy generation, even transmission and storage options. And the costs have really changed. The economics are, I would say, have actually gone out ahead of the policies themselves. And in one of the examples that people have about generational leaps that sometimes happen, they talk about how India initially, when they were thinking about creating a telecom system, they were stringing lots of copper wire so that people could have landline telephones, and then suddenly they said, actually, it just would be a lot cheaper and easier if we built a really good cellular mobile network, and then we wouldn't have to string all this copper wire. It would actually save a lot of money, it'd be better coverage, and be more effective. And I think something like that is actually happening right now in the developing world, where we're coming up with new models for how we think about energy production and distribution than we have used in most of the developed worlds, where we tend to be highly centralized systems, and kind of controlled often by central government authorities or kind of state monopolies. And we're shifting to much more indirect, decentralized systems that are often a lot more flexible, and they tend to be a lot greener too. So that actually is real progress. It's saying we maybe need to develop a new set of solutions. So I feel generally very encouraged about that, because at the end of the day, we need to make sure that we're actually helping people move out of poverty, that we're sustaining our ecosystems, that we're making sure that people have good education, that they're able to take care of their families. And often that means that we need to increase the amount of energy that's available. And if we can do that without also accelerating climate change even more, then all the better. So hopefully that answers that question.
Thank you so much. So going on to the next one from Camilo, wondering if ecosystems are reorganizing themselves around infrastructure and it can shape development for centuries. What is the expectation for countries highly dependent on hydropower, especially in Latin America?
A really good question. By training, I'm an aquatic ecologist, like a wetlands ecologist, and I think very much about how ecosystems are impacted. In general, the way that we have approached infrastructure development for water management has been by building large, often concrete or other types of hard, traditional gray infrastructure. And as I mentioned, as you also echo, Camilo, ecosystems often change really profoundly in response to that infrastructure. So let's say for hydropower, you build a large dam, you're creating a major disruption in the flow of water. And more than that, you're also often changing the quality of the water. Maybe sediment isn't able to go downstream very well. It stops at the dam or a series of dams. The temperature of the water often changes quite radically, especially for a large dam. You could have very cold water that's actually leaving the turbines. The natural movement of the water can alter with especially large dams. Again, say Three Gorges as a good example. It basically converted the Yangtze River into two gigantic lakes. There's the lake above the dam, and because of the way that they have mostly operated the dam for very even water flows, it's kind of a lake below the dam, so there's not a natural variation in the flow regime. And that all of these things tend to have a very strong impact on species and ecosystems and ecosystem processes. So hydropower is an important driver, and it always has been since we started commercial hydropower development in the 1880s globally. And the hydropower dams, they can last a really long time. The first commercial hydropower dam was made around 1887 between two of the North American Great Lakes, Niagara Falls, and it's still in commercial operation. There are many hydropower dams that are over 100 years old, and we're likely to have them continue in place for a long time into the future. So what I would say is that there were also the science about how we think about sustainable water management has made enormous advances over the past 20, 25 years or so. The first really big advance that occurred was understanding that if we want to manage freshwater ecosystems in a more sustainable way, that we need to reflect what's referred to as the natural flow regime. Again, an engineer would call this the annual hydrograph, but most of us, if we're familiar with a river, then we're used to kind of normal times when in the wet season when it's high and low during the dry season, and that this annual variation is very important. Say in some places in East Africa, it may go through that kind of cycling a couple of times a year. And where I live in Western North America, we go through a long wet period and then a long dry period. And so being able to actually operate these dams in a way that reflects that natural cycling already creates an enormous positive impact on the species and ecosystems that live in that system, because you're managing the water so that it has qualities that are more in keeping with what they were used to before that infrastructure arrived. So it's not trying to operate it like a big lake or a couple of lakes, but more like it would if the dam wasn't there. But climate change makes it a little bit harder. And I would say that looking forward, that's one of the big challenges that we have right now. And this is where some of the science is still pretty new. So what do we do when there's the amount of water that's in a system changes? So the Colorado River in North America, for instance, is kind of a famous river for its climate impacts. And most of the water comes from the northern part of the basin, and there's been a lot of decline over the past 20 or 30 years in the amount of water that's in the system. It's just absolutely gone, and it's because of climate change. There's not as much rain. It's not because there are more people taking water. It's not because there's water diversions or water transfers. It's because there's less water there. That is totally a climate change issue. So how do you operate the system then? How do you think about this natural flow regime and how you would operate it? That's where we have a different set of choices, and they will be harder choices. This is where we also get into some of the uncertainties. For the dam operators, their first inclination is to say, especially if the system is losing water, let's store more, let's keep more water there behind the dam. I would say that if we're trying to balance the needs of ecosystems and species with our energy generation needs for the kind of conjoined long-term sustainability of the system, that we need to really think more carefully. We probably need to continue with some type of flow regime management that's usually called an environmental flows program or environmental reserve. In Spanish, it's often called a reserva del agua. And that basically treats the ecosystem itself as a kind of stakeholder in the process. So it is represented in some formal way. And ideally, what would you see? There's places in Tanzania, for instance, in the Pangani Basin or in the Mekong. There's also some environmental flows work there. And Mexico's been a real leader in this area to try to think about how we can combine climate adaptation with environmental flows programs, so that maybe we can try to manage a system with ongoing climate impacts. And so we can start to think about these trade-offs and in a more productive way. So it's new stuff. I would say keep following it, it's creating a kind of new generation of policies. The Inter-American Development Bank is actually implementing this in Latin America, taking some of the lessons that have been learned in Mexico in at least 5 other countries that I'm aware of.
Okay, moving on to the next question. We have from Mona. She's wondering, the water cycle is very sensitive to climate shift, and it's highly related to energy and food and water nexus. So what is the most important and urgent to focus on?
That's really a political question, I would say. It's a governance issue, and it's about how we think about trade-offs. One of the things I find a little mysterious, perhaps, is that I don't see a lot of climate adaptation thinking in terms of water nexus thinking in most cases, and I would like to see how they can come together. Now, what might that look like? I think it's so the nexus. If you're not familiar with the nexus, it's the water, food, energy nexus, and it's really a kind of a policy awareness to help policymakers, often at a regional or national level, in a variety of different sectors, kind of realize that there's a lot of water that's embedded in food production, food preparation, food cycling, that they, in effect, a lot of the human food sourcing includes a lot of water decisions. And so you may be a farmer, you may be running a food processing factory, and you're a water manager, but you haven't thought of yourself that way. Same thing with energy production. Almost every source of energy, except maybe wind and a few types of solar power, are very water intensive. Some of them incredibly water intensive, like biofuels in places like Brazil. And so that, but in many cases, you don't see energy producers that are really aware that they are also water managers, and that they need to really think about the water management decisions that they may implicitly be making. So that's the big insight that has come from the water, food, energy nexus policy agenda. What I think we need to now do is kind of add the climate adaptation layer to it. So a kind of a risk framework. This is my personal view. In process, what that looks like is I would say most of the water, food, energy nexus applications I've seen, they become highly optimized. They, in effect, say this is the perfect balance point between all of these different sectors. And if we can just stay at that point, then we can keep everything perfectly aligned across all of those agendas. What I would say is, what happens, let's start to think about the risks of the amount of water changing, growing or decreasing, or maybe the precipitation patterns shift 2 weeks or a month in one direction, and that can have really profound impacts. If you have a finely balanced kind of brittle system for how we think about trade-offs between, say, hydropower production or coal-fired power plant production, which is also water intensive, and when you need to irrigate, or when cities need a water supply, it's probably most intensive in both cases during the dry season. And if the dry season is a couple of weeks longer, that can make a really big difference. So I think those agendas need to be brought together, and we need essentially a kind of resilient nexus. So I'm hoping that that's where we start to see some of the discussion going. This awareness that there are risks actually in trying to be maybe too prescriptive and too rigid in how we define a sustainable food, water, energy nexus.
All right, thank you. So moving on to the next question from Lucia. She would like to ask how country governments allocate budget for SDG 6. Do they have to allocate it from a communitary budget?
Tough question, Lucia. I think so SDG 6, especially the way it's kind of written in a literal way, is really focused on water supply, water sanitation issues, and I would say that the way that we pay for it is often across a wide range of levels of governance. If you look at many of the NGOs, for instance, or aid agencies or foundations that they focus on water supply and sanitation issues, they often focus on kind of rural water supply and sanitation, and there may not that may have to come from a national level, and it may come from, say, a health budget. But if you look at say cities, it may not come from a national level. It may come from a regional government or a city government level. You have to. I would say you have to look for the funding for SDG 6 at a lot of levels. India, I will point out, however, is doing something really interesting this year. They have very ambitious SDG 6 goals, and a lot of people thought, how could they possibly set such massive goals? And they have really treated it as a national problem, and so they're trying to bring across a wide range of communities a much more kind of top-down approach to how they focus on SDG 6 in particular. So that would be maybe a kind of exceptional approach where you see the national government in particular taking a very firm hand. Thanks.
All right, moving on. Next question comes from Luis. He wonders, the uncertainty of climate projections is in general high, in particular for precipitation. And that is the key input in hydrology. What is your suggestion to use climate predictions in local scale impact models?
A really good question. I would say the first, my question back to you, Luis, is what kind of decision are you trying to make? And what is the level of confidence that you really need to have in those projections? If you are doing something that's quantitative, you're building something, or if the risk, if you get it wrong, say you are working on a utility, or you're managing a sensitive ecosystem, and if you miscalculate significantly the amount of water that's available, or the water quality, or the timing of the water, and you could cause really significant, potentially irreparable losses, then you should be very, very careful about downscaling climate data for the water cycle. In general, for high confidence requirements or high risk requirements, climate models are, in my view, inappropriate. And I think climate models for the water cycle are pretty good if we're looking at a large scale and trying to think maybe over a decade or two in the future. The IPCC, for instance, put together back in 2007 or 8 something called Technical Report 4 on climate change and water, and it essentially recommended that the appropriate scale for the use of most climate models was roughly the size of the Mississippi Basin in North America, which probably takes about 15 or 20% of North America. That's big. That's really, really big. You know, North America, I mean, that's 10% of Africa, probably a third of Europe in scale. Those are really significant scales. So when you try to take a climate model and apply it to a very localized project at the scale of a city, where you're thinking of tens of square kilometers, that's not I would say, a sound application in the current thinking of most people. And that's where you need to think about risk-based approaches, where you might need to think about trying to be more robust, or more flexible in your approaches. Thank you.
All right, great. So next we have a question from Ayabale. Saying, I imagine pressure on water could be causing climate change. Take an example of boreholes drilled per year in Uganda. Can't they have an impact on the hydrological cycle?
So, if I can interpret your question, to make sure that I understand it fully, what I think that you're asking is maybe because of increasing water scarcity, compounded with things like population growth, that and just a normal economic development, people want more reliable water sources, so they start drilling more boreholes, they start using more groundwater, or maybe using more river water, creating water storage systems, and so on. And can that itself alter the hydrological cycle? And I would say absolutely. That is a very important consideration. In fact, one of the problems, especially with groundwater, is we, as a species, historically, we tend to drill wells to obtain groundwater without really understanding what we're doing to the water that's down there. How much water is there? What is sustainable groundwater use? In the part of the U.S., the southern part of the U.S., for instance, there's an ancient aquifer. It's called the Oglala Aquifer. It's one of the largest in the world. And that water is probably somewhere in the order of 15 to 100,000 years old. It's really old water, and it comes from a past glacial period. And it is also one of the areas of the world where we see the most intensive groundwater use. So there are lots of farmers, especially some cities too, but mostly farmers that they want to grow cotton, and it's a very thirsty crop. So they drill down, they suck up a lot of that water, and it's gone. That aquifer is not recharging, really, not in any significant way. So it can drop in the order of several meters a year, and that's very concerning. And that, I would say, in a place like Uganda, we may not understand actually what's happening with those boreholes, and we may not have a good idea. My suggestion from a policy perspective, again, kind of personal advice, is you may have like a kind of short-term goal where you use maybe borehole water, but you also want to be able to think maybe more broadly about trying to bring in some technical expertise so you understand what the recharge cycle is. This is something that's been happening in South Asia that's very interesting, where people have started to modify some of the land cover patterns to actually encourage additional groundwater recharge. And this is in areas of India where we also saw very rapid groundwater loss. It's not just in India; it's other parts of South Asia too, where by understanding where the sensitive zones are and the recharge zones, and then also monitoring that groundwater over time, we can actually maybe bring the groundwater levels back into a more balanced and nuanced process. But the larger question that I think you're asking is, can we hurt the hydrological cycle in a way that also hurts us? And that is absolutely possible. It's where water knowledge, basin thinking, hydrological and ecological insights are really important if we want to make sure that our economic development, our poverty alleviation is ultimately something that is sustainable more than a generation into the future.
Thank you so much. Now we have a question from the Toilet Board Coalition Secretariat in Switzerland. Can you share some best practice of business solutions for water climate risk?
That's a good question, and it's not an easy question. I would say that the private sector is still pretty new to thinking about a climate risk, especially around water resources. And I've talked to a lot of companies, and Many of them have a sense that there are climate risks, but they're not sure how to respond. There's often a kind of mismatch between the scale at which they look into the future, often only a few years. The way that they think about profits and planning is much on a shorter time scale. This is an area where the innovation has actually been occurring primarily with the public sector and with NGOs. Now, I think that is changing, however, and that's important. And I think that we're starting to see some significant shifts. There have been some large water companies in Europe. Veolia, for instance, has been doing some really innovative kind of water governance thinking. I think there are a lot more countries or companies that have taken on board some of these ideas about water stewardship. And it tends to be, they tend to not think about climate change that much per se, but they are thinking, our water doesn't just come from a city utility, it actually comes from a basin, it comes from a river, and it comes from distant mountains or from an aquifer. We need to actually think about the decisions that we're making and how to ensure that that we play a more balanced role in the community of users in which we're embedded. That's really good, but I think that we're still kind of in early days. Now, there are some interesting developments. Most of the companies you tend to hear about that are working in water and climate, they tend to be real water companies. You know, Veolia's, they supply water, they make beverages. Diageo, for instance, a great big brewery and liquor company that works globally. They also have kind of a very green label around water. What I think is interesting is when we start to move away from those kinds of companies and think who else is really starting to think about water sustainability. I had a very interesting conversation with a large petrochemical a company representative, and they're trying to think about their water and climate risk exposure. And they tend to invest in much longer time scales. Their facilities last many decades. There's some 100-year-old petrochemical facilities that are around. You know, that's where climate change has a very clear impact, and they have experienced it, I'm sure, internally. I've had a meeting next week with some technology companies, actually, that are very interested in their energy generation and their water and climate risk exposure in their data centers. That's very interesting. That is where again, in this water stewardship model, they're trying to think, what are the community of users? How do we work together so that everyone has enough water directly or indirectly? So I think it's new. I'd say stay tuned and see where things evolve. But thanks for that question.
Yes, we are receiving a lot of questions. They're all very interesting. I'm trying to include as many as possible, but please bear with me. I don't think we will be able to answer all. But I appreciate that you're all very engaged in this subject. So moving on to the next question. This is actually, I'm combining two questions, one from Severini and one from Donna. So Severini is asking, how can climate change and its effect on water access be explained to a layman in the village? For us to be successful in anything, we need to do a bottom-up approach because understanding is key. And Donna was also asking, how do you educate and work with the communities and local stakeholders at a very basic level?
That's a really good question. You know, one of the very first talks I had, I gave publicly was to a group of farmers, and I was invited to speak. That most of them had kind of large properties. They had some livestock too. They grew corn and wheat, and I was giving a talk about climate change, and there were these mostly very conservative men, and they kind of sat there with their arms crossed and looked very skeptically at me. I gave a quick talk, about 10-15 minutes, and then I asked if there were any questions. There was silence. You know, I think it's really I think it's really challenging. Maybe if I were to go back and talk to those farmers, I think I'd flip it. Instead of standing at the front of the room and trying to talk to them, I think I would try to use more of this bottom-up approach that Severini, hopefully I'm pronouncing that name correctly, mentioned. How I would say, have you seen any changes? What are the things that are important to you about especially water, and in terms of irrigation or household needs, or maybe look into some of the indirect things like with energy or transport, aquaculture, things like that, and try to find out what are the things that are important to them, and see if they have noticed changes, because often that actually is a really important way of learning. In many parts of the world, I've worked up in the Tibetan Plateau, for instance, we don't really know about a lot of the climate impacts that are happening there. You have to ask them. I was on a tour once on the Tibetan Plateau in Western China. We drove for about 1,000 kilometers, and we talked to lots of government officials and also some of the yak herders that were there. And we'd stay with them, and we would interview them, and some of the monks in the monasteries too. We'd ask them, what are the changes that you've seen? And they were very forthcoming. They were very aware of many of those impacts. And once you get a sense of what's important to them, maybe what the connection with water is, and if they have also absorbed some changes, that gives you a really strong basis, I think, for actually talking with people. But I think it's also possible to sometimes overestimate how much people kind of need to know about climate change, especially kind of learning all at once. Like, I'm here to give you this big brain dump, and I'm from another continent or from some university. My sense is that that's not necessary either, and we certainly don't need to be showing a lot of things around long PowerPoints about the IPCC in a lot of rural communities. Let's be practical. If they want to know more, then let's let them ask for it, and we can let them know, here are the things that are maybe important to you, and if you have more questions, then how can we help? But really focus on kind of practical, simple needs.
Thank you for that, John. Now let's move to the urban areas, because we have two questions from Jane and Onyango. Jane is asking, are there good behaviors to be encouraged in urban situation? And Onyango was asking, how do we address the water crisis in the face of urbanizations? Cities like Cape Town are continuing to have witnessing long periods of drought.
Great questions. One of my favorite sayings is that water flows towards money, and especially if we have a kind of a scientific orientation, we want to think that water moves in basins. But I would say for humans, it goes towards money, and cities are where a lot of money is. So historically, if you're looking at a region, and Cape Town's a great example. It has basically replumbed much of the Western Cape, so that it's moving water across basins. South Africa has one of the most intensive water management, water transfer systems in the world. It's something that many other countries, I'm sure, envy on some level. Even so, Cape Town got into trouble. I think by one estimate, it's a little controversial with some people, but by one estimate, they had an 800-year drought. And 800 years ago, or for the last 800 years, Cape Town has mostly been a lot smaller than it is right now. A lot fewer people and a lot less water-intensive use. We could say the same thing about Sao Paulo in Brazil, or Mexico City, Los Angeles in the U.S., Atlanta in the U.S. And even I'm here in the Netherlands, in The Hague right now, that the Dutch have started to get worried about droughts as well. I was in a government ministry yesterday, and was talking to a senior official, and he is especially worried about drought. So how do we go about moving from a diagnosis to actually trying to think about solutions? And I'd say that the first really big issue is to understand the kind of how does the system work now, and that's often readily accessible knowledge. It's something that you can put together as a stakeholder process, and really it also means setting priorities. It's using a governance process. What are the services? What are the choices that we want to make as a community about how we want to value water? And it really should include the kind of larger extended basin. So a good example here is Mexico City. Mexico City with the World Bank has done a very interesting process. So Mexico City, it's a mega city, about 20 million odd people, though. It's also Mexico State now, and it's a closed basin. It actually used to be a lake 500 years ago. But outside of that basin, kind of over the mountains, they're from two locations. They pump in additional water to the basin, and the World Bank said, this city is important. We need to make sure the city is sustainable, and acting with all levels of governance from inside the hydrological basin of Mexico City, and then outside of it to these other related basins, is brought together something like 4 dozen or 5 dozen different groups, some of them NGOs, some of them community groups, national government, state governments, many cities. What they have really done is they've defined the urban landscape, the urban water landscape. And that is a really useful approach. And they've created a whole series of workshops with all of these groups to help them understand what are the limits that they work in now. It's not just about building new infrastructure. It's also about making different choices. How do we consume water? How do we treat water? How do we process and store water? What really do we want our community to look like in the future? And that's a very different way of saying that it's just a water scarcity issue. It's actually our vision of the future for these communities. And I think Cape Town has done an admirable job as well. Amman, Jordan, I think, is actually doing a really interesting body of work too, and how they treated their Amman's major water stressor is not just climate, it's also from some quite old refugee communities, and how do they make sure that they have an equitable future? They're part of the key stakeholders for the city of Amman, even though they're not necessarily in Amman. So that kind of joint decision making, I think, is really promising. It's one of the really good developments that we've seen over the past 30 or 40 years in water management. Thanks.
All right, moving on. Jordi is wondering, are there any systems in plans to tackle salinization of water in coastal areas combined with erratic rainfalls? This is a pressing issue in countries like Gambia in West Africa.
It's thank you, Jordi. It's a really important issue. Again, I'd say South Asia, Southeast Asia, a widespread issue there. But there's some parts of Central and South America where it's also really important. I suspect in some parts of Australia it's also really critical, and all across the small island states, the Caribbean, the Pacific Islands, and so on. This is a really critical issue, and there's two components of it in my mind. One of them is that you have rising sea level, so that as sea level rises, it tends to come in, and it can profoundly alter the surface waters and the soils. And then there's also the problem of those waters coming in and altering the groundwater. So in effect, the saline tongue of water, it's often called the tongue, gets kind of pulled up, it gets higher, and so boreholes, wells, even some surface waters can be quite altered through kind of saline groundwater intrusion. It's a difficult issue. I would say it's kind of a management issue. It's like a chronic health problem like diabetes, except that in many cases it probably won't end well. And I think you can do things to slow it down in most cases. And that makes it a pretty serious challenge to deal with. So thinking about maybe rainwater harvesting if you're a small island state, maybe trying to depend less on groundwater, maybe use water from farther inland. That's something that you see happening in coastal areas. Sometimes you can also use stormwater systems to kind of push water back down into the system, kind of pumping it back down, and that can push the tongue of water back out. There have been issues in large rivers, even the Yangtze is a good example, or the Mekong, where when they change the flow regime so that maybe there's less force of water because someone's built a dam, there's more water storage, or the flow regime has been altered by dam operations, that it may actually cause salt water to come higher up in the river. And that can be really problematic. And that actually has been a significant issue for the city of Shanghai, near the mouth of the Yangtze. Used to be a very rare occurrence that their water supply system on Chongmingdao, this big island in the Yangtze, only rarely had any salt water in it, and now it happens several times a year in many ways because of the combination of sea level rise and dam operation. So it's a growing problem, and I would say it's part of this cluster of problems that we have in coastal areas where we're committed to so much sea level rise and more sea level or saline intrusion into groundwater systems. So, and that's going to be part of a broader set of choices that we have to make about how do we want to manage these coastal systems over long periods of time. Can we move the cities, move communities? Can we raise them up some way? Can we find alternative approaches to resource management? Thanks.
Yes, so many interesting questions. I'm learning a lot just by listening. So let's have, I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions, then we have to wrap up. And we have a question from Bill. He's wondering, in your opinion, what are some of the most promising technologies or innovations with respect to water management, specifically with respect to urban wastewater treatment?
That's a really good question, Bill. I think that to me, the really exciting ones are that we're starting to go back to things that we knew, maybe 300 or 500 years ago, which is that we actually need to think of ecosystems as part of our infrastructure. I don't know that 500 years ago we were using the word infrastructure very much, and we certainly weren't thinking at the scale that we do now. But wetlands were our water treatment system back then. It wasn't just try to move the waste away from it. Is that we knew that we had to integrate. For instance, sponge cities are a really interesting idea. It's been as an approach, it's being used worldwide, but the term sponge city is particularly associated with China. The Asian Development Bank is investing quite heavily in promoting sponge cities in China and other countries in Asia. That's really intriguing. It basically is allowing the city to kind of embrace stormwater and wastewater and trying to let the city flood in a sustainable way. There's a British company, Arup, that has done some fantastic work in the city of Hull in England. That this firm works globally, but they have done really interesting work at kind of changing the way that the city experiences floods and stormwater systems. I think another really interesting innovation there, in addition to nature-based solutions and kind of planned integrated failure, is the idea that actually some of these sources of so-called wastewater are themselves assets, and that we need to think of them as resources that are have positive values as well as negative values. So here, managed aquifer recharge is really kind of a new interesting idea that I've run across in a number of instances where if you can at least make sure that you've got pretty clean water, you have a kind of maybe periods of high abundance of water, then let's pump it down into effectively a giant underground reservoir, and then we can use it later during a dry season or during a drought. And that's a fantastic approach to how we think about wastewater. It's an asset that we actually need to value, and in the more general term is a circular economy. But I think it's a really nice example of a circular economy. Thanks.
All right, so a question from Eduardo. He wanted to know about other policy tools different than river basin management plans to address climate change adaptation and integrated water resources management, because these are the main tools that they use in Spain.
That's true. I mean, Spain is interesting. I think it's one of the things that's kind of innovative in Spain. It's actually, I think, quite ancient in Spain. Must go back to maybe the Moorish period or earlier even, in thinking about basins and this kind of awareness about basins. I've done some work with the Duero River Basin in Spain, actually, on climate adaptation, and there's been some really innovative thinking about environmental flows in Spain, and that's starting to move as well, I believe, into climate adaptation. But so what are some other tools that are important? I think what is new is that we in terms of a policy instrument is especially how we've to refer to the previous question, how we value water itself, and we tend to value water economically, in terms of like assuming that this water has a fairly fixed and kind of knowable value. We're not pricing in effect, the uncertainty around it. There's been some innovation in trying to think about how to price in, how to reflect effectively the cost of uncertainty, and this comes with the idea of say real options analyses. That's an approach that goes back to the 60s, but has really become much more important in policy circles and policy instruments, as an approach to flexibility, that dynamic adaptation pathways, policy pathways, DAPP, sometimes called adaptation pathways, developed here in the Netherlands, is another way to think about flexibility and uncertainty from a policy perspective. I like that methodology quite a bit, and you can use an economic framework, but you don't have to. You can really just talk about the kind of alternative approaches and making sure that you don't get into a decision box. I think those are really effective methodologies too, because they also help policymakers start to look in the future more usefully. I'd say the last area where I've seen some innovation has been looking at co-benefits. We tend, in the highly optimized way that we've tended to focus on water for the past 100 years or so, we tend to focus on one or two problems and then one or two solutions. And I think what is ultimately driving a lot of the innovation, say with nature-based solutions, say with IWRM or environmental flows, is the idea that in a highly optimized solution, maybe we come up with it comes up with like an 80% solution to a problem, but maybe there's this other approach that is a 70% solution, but it also has all these other interesting co-benefits with it. Maybe it actually helps a group of poor communities, or it helps develop a new industry, or it changes some gender balance in a particular area, or it has positive environmental benefits, or maybe it just makes people feel better about their community, that it's a nicer place to live. Well, one of the best stories I have about that is from a city in northern Thailand. A colleague of mine was working with the mayor and Hydropower Authority and some of the local irrigators and really just the inhabitants of this city. It's a dynamic, rapidly growing city, and they thought we have a stormwater problem, we have a water storage problem in the dry season. We're always worried if we're going to have enough water to keep generating electricity and irrigate as much as we need to. And in the end, the city really said the biggest issue actually that we have is, how do we keep this place livable? How do we make sure that we grow in a positive way, that we want to keep living here and that we like our city and feel proud of it? And they came up with a nature-based solution of lakes that they're constructing right now that flow through the city, that help capture stormwater, help store water for the other water uses, but they also reflect a positive vision for what the city can be. And they're really using climate adaptation as a way to make their place, the city, a nicer place to live, and to continue that way into the future. And that's a really positive approach. That's the real strength to me of what a bottom-up approach to risk assessment and stakeholder engagement can really bring. Thanks.
Thank you so much, John. Do we have one student, Gualatli, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, wondering, how do I join AGWA in Botswana?
Okay, all right. Well, thank you for asking. We're a members network, and you can visit our website. We actually have two websites. There's Alliance, and then the number 4 water.org, and there's also AGWA Guide, which is more technical information. Alliance for Water.org has more information that's on the organization itself and some of our policy programs. AGWAGuide.org is more a kind of technical guidance and learning tools and so on. So if you are interested in being in AGWA, then you're in AGWA. We have a couple of newsletters. We have a general member newsletter. We have a kind of a technical practice newsletter. What are the things that are innovating there? New papers and practices, new insights, and then we also have a policy newsletter. And we have 2 LinkedIn groups. One is for students and young professionals, and then one is the kind of more general members. And we're also on Facebook. So please, join us. I really welcome you. I travel all over the world, representing AGWA. I've been to Southern Africa a number of times, and I would love to see you in Botswana. So I hope you and others will join. Thank you.
All right, I think we have to wrap up. We're running over time now. So I want to thank you, John, for taking the time to answer these very complex and interesting questions. I want to thank all our students for taking the time to actually tune in and watching this live webinar. I mean, we can only make this as great as the students make it. And also thank you to all the students that let us know that they weren't seeing the screen. We fixed it, and hopefully it worked. If you have any technical issues, you can always comment to us. Please, I know that many didn't get responses to their questions, and I'm sorry for that, but we don't really have time for that. So continue discussing with each other, post in the discussion forums. You know that many of you are professors, and some of you are working in this field. So it's not only students in universities that are signed up for the course. So talk with each other. I'm sure you can teach each other a lot. So yes, we will also, somebody asked about the video. We will post it on the edX platform, so don't worry about that. You can always watch this one afterwards and share it with all your friends. If you have any issues at all or questions, you can always reach out to us, the water course team, at water@sdgacademy.org. Again, I want to thank you all, and especially I want to thank you, John, for taking the time to do this. And I wish you all a lovely day or evening or afternoon or wherever you are in the world.
Okay, thank you all so much. It's nice to virtually meet you. I hope we get to meet in person.